In a world of constant digital noise, a single metallic whisper can change the course of destiny in an instant. We explore the subtle power of influence and the hidden signals that drive the gears of our modern society. Click subscribe now and listen to what the future is saying.
My name is Frank Calloway, and I am 67 years old. At my son's 40th birthday party, his wife grabbed the microphone in front of 200 guests and told everyone that I was an embarrassment to the family. She said it with a smile. She said it like it was a joke. And for about 4 minutes, the whole room laughed along with her. What she didn't know was that the room they were laughing in belonged to me. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. Hit that like button if you believe that respect inside a family should never have a price tag. And leave me a comment. Tell me where in this country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. I want to start, though, not with the party. I want to start with Margaret. My wife Margaret passed 8 years ago, just 3 months after Daniel turned 32. Pancreatic cancer. We had 11 weeks from diagnosis to the day I held her hand for the last time. And in those 11 weeks, I watched the most remarkable woman I had ever known shrink down to something almost unrecognizable and still managed to smile at me every single morning when I walked into her hospital room. She had this way of tilting her head when she looked at me just slightly to the left, like she was always about to tell me something important. She kept doing it even at the end, even when speaking had become difficult. That tilt, I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes. Margaret and I built everything together. I mean that literally. I started Calloway Construction when I was 29 years old with a second-hand backhoe, a reliable foreman named Pete Danvers, and a woman beside me who believed in the work before the work had proven itself. We were never flashy people. We drove practical trucks. We wore work boots to dinner more often than dress shoes. Margaret used to say that the people most worth knowing never needed to announce themselves, and that became a kind of compass for how we moved through the world. By the time she passed, Calloway Construction had built or renovated more than 300 commercial properties across 2 states. Our portfolio was substantial, but we had done it quietly. The way you do things when the work itself is the point, and not the applause that follows. Most people who saw me at the hardware store or pumping gas on a Tuesday morning saw a weathered older man in a flannel shirt and didn't think much beyond that. Margaret loved that about how we lived. She said it kept us honest. After she was gone, the house got very large and very quiet. I kept the business running through a board of directors I trusted completely, the same people who had been with us for years, and I stepped back from the day-to-day. I moved into a smaller house, the original one Margaret and I had bought when we were first married, a modest craftsman on Sycamore Street that we had always kept and never sold, because it was where Daniel had taken his first steps and where Margaret had planted a rose garden that still bloomed every June without anyone asking it to. I drove the same 2009 Ford F-150 that had 190,000 miles on it and a crack in the dashboard from the summer of 2014 when I left a coffee thermos on the seat in 90-degree heat. I wore my flannel shirts and my work boots. I lived on a comfortable fixed income drawn from the trust that my attorney, Sandra Mills, had helped me build after Margaret died. The trust was Margaret's idea, actually. She had brought it up in that quiet, precise way she had about 2 years before she got sick. "Frank," she said one evening while we were sitting on the back porch, "I want to know that what we built is protected." She had seen too many families torn apart by inheritance disputes. She had watched a neighbor's children turn on each other over a modest estate that wasn't even particularly valuable. "Promise me," she said, "that you'll build a fence around it." So I did. Sandra and I spent 6 months constructing a legal architecture that was, in Sandra's words, airtight at every seam. The Margaret Calloway Legacy Trust held everything: the properties, the business interest, the investments. I was the administrator and the primary beneficiary. On paper, to anyone who cared to look, Frank Calloway was a retired man of modest means, living in a small house with an old truck. It was a filter. Margaret had designed it as a filter without knowing she was designing it. And over the years after she was gone, it showed me things about people that I might never have seen otherwise. My son Daniel is a good man. I want to say that clearly before I say anything else, because none of what happened is a simple story about a bad son. Daniel is hardworking, genuinely kind, and capable of a loyalty that most people never develop. He has his mother's eyes and her way of listening carefully before he speaks. What he also has, and I say this with full awareness, that some of the responsibility belongs to me, is a deep and persistent need to be accepted by people he perceives as being above him. Margaret used to call it his tender spot. She would cup his face in her hands when he was small and say, "Daniel, baby, you don't need any room's permission to belong in it." He understood her, but understanding something and being free of it are not always the same thing. He met Victoria Ashworth at a corporate event 4 years after Margaret passed. Victoria is beautiful in the way that certain things are beautiful, polished, and deliberate, and designed to be noticed. Her family had old money, or what remained of old money after 2 generations of poor decisions had quietly hollowed out the original fortune. The Ashworths still had the name. They still had the house in Greenwich. They still had the social connections and the particular brand of confidence that comes from having been told your whole life that you are a certain kind of people. What they no longer had, though they worked very hard to prevent anyone from noticing, was the actual financial substance to back any of it up. I did not know this at first. I noticed the way Victoria looked around my house on Sycamore Street the first time Daniel brought her to dinner. Not rude, nothing you could point to directly, but the kind of glance that catalogs and assesses and files away. I noticed that she never asked me anything about my life or my work. I noticed that she referred to my truck, once, as charmingly vintage, which is the kind of compliment that isn't one, but people can have their blind spots. I gave her time. The requests started small, the way they always do. Daniel called one evening asking if I could help cover a last-minute cost for a weekend trip they'd planned. "Just a bridge loan, Dad. I'll get it back to you." $300. I didn't hesitate. But then there was another call 2 weeks later. A work dinner Victoria had to attend. Could I help with the dress? $500 this time. Then $1,000 for what was described as a networking opportunity. Then $2,200 because Daniel said they needed new furniture for the living room because Victoria's mother was coming to visit and the old couch was, and he paused before saying this, not quite right. I paid each time. I said nothing. I was watching. The thing about watching is that you start to see the architecture of a situation, how the beams are placed, where the load-bearing walls are, what the whole structure is actually built to do. And what I saw, slowly and then with increasing clarity, was that Victoria was managing Daniel the way a project manager manages a budget. She knew exactly how much patience to apply, exactly when to deploy warmth and when to deploy distance. She was not cruel to him. That's the part that made it complicated. She was strategic. Daniel felt loved, and he was being optimized. Her mother, Eleanor Ashworth, came to visit twice in the first year of the marriage. Eleanor was 71, impeccably dressed, and weaponized with the particular social skill of making you feel slightly inadequate without ever saying anything you could directly object to. The second time she visited, I drove over on a Sunday for a family lunch. I parked my truck on the street. Eleanor watched me get out from the front window, and when I came inside, she said, with her head tilted in a way that was nothing like Margaret's tilt, "Frank, you know there are wonderful lease programs now, even for people in their retirement years. Something a little more presentable might make Daniel feel better when you come to visit." She said it while pouring coffee. She moved on to the weather before I could respond. Daniel did not say anything. That was the first real weight I felt. 6 months before the party, Victoria called me directly for the first time. She was warm, warmer than usual, and that warmth had the temperature of something calculated. She told me that she and Daniel were planning his 40th birthday at Meridian, a restaurant in the city that she described as exactly the right setting for the milestone. She said the private dining room seated 200 and that the catering package they'd selected was spectacular. Then she told me what the cost was going to be, $48,000. She paused after saying it. "We were hoping you might want to be part of making it special," she said, as his father. I told her I would think about it. What I did not tell her was that I owned the building Meridian was located in. I had purchased that block of commercial properties 11 years earlier through a subsidiary of the legacy trust called Callaway Meridian Holdings. The restaurant itself was a tenant. Their lease was managed through a property company that handled all communication, so they knew their landlord's name only as a corporate entity. Victoria had chosen the venue without knowing. It was not something I orchestrated. It was simply how things were. But when she called me with that price, I set the phone down for a moment and thought about Margaret and her fence and her filter. And I understood that the filter was still working. I told Victoria I would be glad to attend the party. I did not offer to pay for it. The Friday before the party, Daniel called. His voice had a rehearsed quality, which meant Victoria was either in the room or had recently had a conversation with him. He said that the cost of the event had grown slightly, and that they were working through some financial pressure right now. He asked if I might be able to help with whatever felt comfortable. I asked him how much. He said 60,000. I asked him when he needed to know. He said tomorrow. I said I would call him back. I did not call him back. I called Sandra instead. Sandra Mills has been my attorney for 26 years. She is not a soft woman in the way that term is usually meant, but she has a quality of precision that I have always found deeply reassuring, the precision of someone who understands exactly how things work and has no patience for pretending otherwise. I told her everything I had been watching for the past 2 years. I told her about the money, the requests, the slowly shifting angle of Daniel's communication with me. I told her about Eleanor and the truck. I told her about the prenuptial agreement Victoria had mentioned in passing, the one Daniel had signed before the wedding without asking me to look at it, the one that Sandra, when I described its basic terms, told me quietly contained some very aggressive provisions around inherited assets. Then I told Sandra about the party. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the tone she uses when she has already thought 3 steps ahead, "Frank, do you want to handle this, or do you want to correct it?" I said I wanted to correct it. She said, "Then let me make a call in the morning." I also called Tom Haskell that night. We came up in the construction business at the same time, competed fiercely for contracts in our 30s, and then discovered over a long dinner in 1998 that we respected each other too much to keep being adversaries. Tom is the kind of man who fills a room without trying to. He has a voice like gravel rolling downhill and a laugh that comes from somewhere genuine. He knew Margaret well. He gave the best eulogy at her funeral, and he cried through half of it, and nobody thought less of him for it. I told Tom what was happening. He listened without interrupting, which is one of his rarest qualities. When I finished, he made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" I told him I needed him at the party. I told him what I needed him to do when the time came. He said, "Frank, consider it done." The day of the party, I put on a clean flannel shirt, my good dark jeans, and my dress boots, the ones Margaret had bought me for our 30th anniversary, still in good condition because I wore them carefully. I drove my truck to the city and parked 3 blocks from Meridian. I arrived early, before the guests, and I stood for a moment on the sidewalk looking at the building. The stone facade was the original 1940s masonry. I had overseen its restoration myself 8 years ago, replacing a dozen damaged courses by hand, because I wanted it done right. I put my hand on the cornerstone for just a moment before I went inside. The party was everything Victoria had designed it to be. Meridian's private dining room was beautiful, warm lighting, fresh flowers, the kind of quiet elegance that announces money without shouting about it. The guests were largely Victoria's circle and Daniel's work colleagues, polished and well-dressed. I took my seat near the back of the room, as I always do at these events, and I watched. Daniel came and found me immediately. He hugged me with real warmth, and I felt, holding him, the weight of everything I was carrying that he didn't yet know about. He looked happy. He looked proud. He looked like a man who had worked very hard for something and was finally standing inside it. I felt a twist of love for him that was almost painful. Victoria greeted me with a cheek kiss and a smile that was practiced to 3 decimal places. Eleanor Ashworth stood nearby, wearing pearls and an expression of mild tolerance. She looked at my shirt, She looked at my boots. She did not say anything. The looking was enough. The evening moved through its courses. The food was genuinely exceptional. I made a note to tell the restaurant's management, my management, that the new chef was performing at a high level. The conversation at my end of the table was pleasant in a surface way, the kind of pleasant that doesn't ask real questions. I ate my dinner, I drank my water, I waited. It was during the dessert course that Victoria stood up. She tapped her champagne glass with a small spoon, and the room quieted. She looked luminous at the head of the table. She had the room's complete attention, and she knew it. And she moved through that attention the way certain people do, as though it were a natural habitat. She spoke about Daniel warmly and cleverly, about what he had built in his career, about the man he was, about their life together. People laughed at the right moments and touched their hearts at others. She was good at this. And then she said she wanted to tell a little story. She said it with a brightness that told me the brightness was a delivery mechanism. She said she wanted to share something that she found endearing in a very particular way. She said that when she and Daniel had gotten married, she had looked forward to getting to know her father-in-law, who she'd heard so much about. She said she had been told he was a legend in the construction business. She paused. She smiled at me across the room. And then I met Frank, she said, and the warmth in her voice had developed a slight, precise edge, like a knife that has been wrapped in velvet for presentation. And Frank showed up to our engagement dinner in a truck that I genuinely thought had been recovered from a demolition site. Laughter from her side of the room. And Frank wore a shirt that I believe had been patched in 2 places. And Frank, she gestured toward me in a way that was ostensibly affectionate but framed me like an exhibit. Frank is exactly as advertised. He is a man of very simple tastes. More laughter, which is wonderful, it really is. Because Daniel tells me that his father's entire retirement savings is approximately enough to cover what we spent on flowers tonight. She laughed first, showing the room it was safe to laugh. Many of them did. Daniel was not laughing. I could see him from where I sat, and his face had gone the color of someone who had been hoping something wouldn't happen and has just watched it happen anyway. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow sip. I set it back down. I did not perform distress. I have been on job sites where things went badly wrong. Structural failures, collapses, emergencies, and the most important thing I ever learned was that the quality of your response is directly determined by the quality of your composure. Victoria was beginning to pivot toward a toast when Tom Haskell stood up. Tom is a large man. When he stands in a room, the room adjusts to account for him. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood, and the quality of his standing was enough to redirect the room's attention entirely. "Victoria," he said, with a politeness so precise it had edges, "I want to make sure everyone here has the full picture before we raise our glasses." He looked around the room slowly, the way a man looks around a room when he has spent 40 years commanding job sites and boardrooms and he knows time is on his side. Because I've known Frank Calloway for 34 years. And I think some of his son's guests deserve to know who they're in the room with tonight. Victoria's smile remained but had lost its ease. "The building we're standing in," Tom said, and his voice carried to every corner without effort, "is owned by Calloway Meridian Holdings, which is a subsidiary of the Margaret Calloway Legacy Trust." He paused. "Frank has owned this block since 2013. Meridian is a tenant." Another pause. Longer this time. "Frank, how many commercial properties does the trust hold right now?" I looked up. I did not perform surprise. "Last count, just over 400, I said. The silence in the room had a texture. It was the silence of 200 people recalibrating something fundamental. Tom was not finished. "The simple tastes Victoria mentioned. That truck Frank drives was the truck Margaret drove to every job site they built together for 15 years. Frank keeps it because it belonged to her." Tom's voice shifted just slightly. Not harder, but more direct. "And the retirement savings that apparently couldn't cover the flowers tonight? I'd encourage Victoria in the future to look up a company called Calloway Construction before she makes estimates at a dinner table." Eleanor Ashworth had gone very still. Her champagne glass was in her hand, and she seemed to have forgotten it was there. Victoria was still standing. For the first time all evening, the room was not in her hand. She looked at me, and I saw her recalculate in real time. The same rapid recalibration I had seen in contractors who had just been told the load-bearing wall was in a different place than their drawings showed. She attempted a laugh. Tom, obviously I was joking. It was a public joke, Tom said, not unkindly, about a man who built more of this city than most people in this room have ever driven past. I wanted to make sure the room had the full picture. That's all. He raised his own glass. Happy birthday, Daniel. He sat down. The room tried to find its footing. People looked at their plates. Some looked at me. Some looked at Victoria. A few looked at Daniel, who was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was a boy. The expression of someone who has understood something too late and is asking, without words, if understanding it now is enough. I did not look away from him. I held his gaze for a long moment. Then I stood up. I was not angry. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was something colder and more structural than anger, the feeling of a man who has been watching a building develop cracks for a long time and has finally prepared the proper documentation. I buttoned the middle button of my flannel shirt, which is a habit from job sites, a thing I do when I'm about to say something that needs to be said correctly. I cleared my throat once. Daniel, I said, I love you. I want you to hear that first, because everything I say after it is still true at the same time. The room was completely quiet. Your mother and I spent 40 years building something. We built it because the work was worth doing, not because we needed people to know we had done it. Your mother believed that how you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you is the only honest measurement of your character. I paused. She was right. I looked briefly at Victoria. Not with malice. With the directness of a man who has just reviewed a faulty structural report. I have watched, over the past 2 years, a very systematic effort to determine the size of the inheritance you're expecting from me. I've watched requests that came one at a time so they seem smaller than they were. I watched a prenuptial agreement that your attorney, if you care to have someone review it, will confirm was designed to capture my estate in the event of a divorce. I said all of this without raising my voice. And I watched my son, my intelligent, capable, good son, let it happen. Because he has always wanted, more than almost anything, to belong somewhere that felt important. Daniel's jaw was tight. His eyes were wet. He was not looking away. Sandra, I said. Sandra Mills came through the door from the hallway, where she had been waiting. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and carrying a slim leather folder, and she moved through the room with the unhurried authority of someone who is never not prepared. She set the folder on the table in front of her, opened it to the first document, and slid it toward Victoria's chair. The prenuptial agreement signed prior to your marriage contains provisions regarding inherited assets, Sandra said, without introduction or ceremony. Those provisions are unenforceable for 2 reasons. First, the trust predates the marriage by 10 years. The assets were never Frank's personal property to begin with, which means they cannot be treated as marital property under this state's framework. Second, the trust contains an irrevocability clause and a named succession directive. She removed a second document. Upon Frank's passing, control of the trust transfers to a board of trustees, not to any individual heir. The succession directive, which cannot be altered without unanimous board approval, designates the trust's assets to a combination of charitable interests and specific named beneficiaries. She paused. Daniel is named as a beneficiary. His portion is conditional. Victoria's mother spoke for the first time, a tight and careful voice. Conditional on what? Sandra looked at her with the expression of a person who has no investment in softening true things. On the administrator's determination that the beneficiary has demonstrated, over time, the kind of character the trust was built to reward. She closed the folder. Frank has the discretion to revisit that determination at any point. The room had gone somewhere very still. Eleanor's composure, which had been formidable all evening, had developed a visible crack. She was looking at her daughter. Victoria was looking at the folder. I watched Daniel. He was not looking at Victoria. He was looking at his hands, which were folded on the table in front of him, and he was very still in the way that people are still, when something large has rearranged itself inside them, and they are waiting to see what the new arrangement looks like. I walked around the table toward him. The room divided to let me pass without anyone having to be asked. I pulled out the chair beside him and sat down. I did not put my hand on his shoulder. I did not make a gesture for the room. I simply sat beside my son and spoke to him quietly. "I'm not doing this to punish you," I said. "I'm doing it because your mother would have wanted you to know the truth while there's still time to do something with it. You are 40 years old. You have your whole second act in front of you. But it starts with you being honest with yourself about what you've been allowing to happen." I looked at him until he looked back at me. "The man I raised you to be, that man, is still in there. I've seen him. I've watched you choose him. Sometimes, when things were hard, I need you to choose him now." Daniel put his face in his hands. His shoulders moved once, twice. He was not performing. He was doing the thing that men do in private, very rarely, when something has broken open. I sat beside him and let it happen, the way his mother would have. After a while, he reached out and gripped my forearm with both of his hands. He didn't say anything. I put my other hand over his, and we sat like that for a moment that had nothing to do with anyone else in the room. I stood up. I looked at Victoria once more, not with cruelty but with the clarity that I owed her, because clarity is more honest than contempt. "You are a smart woman," I said. "I mean that genuinely. What you built in this marriage, you built deliberately, and you built well. I'd encourage you to use those skills to build something that belongs to you, something that isn't borrowed from someone else's foundation. That's not a judgment. It's an observation." I straightened my shirt. "The restaurant staff tonight has been exceptional. Sandra, please see to it that every server and kitchen staff member receives a bonus equal to their full evening's pay." I took my jacket from the back of my chair. "The balance of the Trust's discretionary account for this evening's event will be redirected, first thing Monday morning, to the Margaret Callaway Pediatric Recovery Fund at St. Anthony's Hospital. It's a fund that pays for things small children need when they're getting well: books, music, a stuffed animal if a parent can't afford one." Margaret always thought it was the right use for money. I picked up my jacket and put it on. Tom Haskell fell into step beside me without needing to be asked. His hand on my shoulder was brief and solid. We walked out through the dining room, past tables that had gone very quiet, past servers holding dessert plates who had stopped to watch, through the heavy front door and out onto the sidewalk where the evening air had gone cool and a half moon sat cleanly above the buildings. Tom let out a long, slow breath. Margaret would have loved every minute of that. I thought about that for a moment. The rose garden in June, the tilt of her head, the way she put her hands on Daniel's face when he was small. She would have told me I was a little heavy-handed with the Sandra entrance, I said. Tom laughed that real laugh, the one from somewhere genuine. Only a little. We walked to my truck. The crack in the dashboard caught the light from a street lamp. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. 3 weeks later, Daniel came to the house on Sycamore Street alone. It was a Saturday morning. Early. The kind of morning Margaret had always loved best. He knocked before coming in, even though the door was unlocked, and he stood in the kitchen looking at the counter where her cookbook still sat in the order she had arranged them. He looked older than 40. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping cleanly. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and he talked, really talked. For the first time in what felt like years, not performing anything, not managing me, just talking. He told me things I had suspected, and some I hadn't. He told me he had known about the prenuptial provisions and had convinced himself they were standard. He said the word convinced with the particular tiredness of someone who has stopped pretending to themselves. He told me that he had understood, at the party, in the moment Tom stood up, that he had been making himself smaller for a long time, and that he had let me be made smaller too, and that he didn't know how to explain why he had let that happen, except that he had wanted very badly for a particular kind of life to be real. I listened. I did not interrupt him. It is the thing I am best at. The thing Margaret taught me. The patience to let someone find their own words for what they are trying to say. When he was finished, the kitchen was quiet. Outside, the rose garden was coming up. The same canes, and the same relentless June color. "What happens now?" he asked. I looked at my son. I saw his mother in his face, the way I always do, in the angle of his jaw, and the particular way he holds his hands when he is being honest. "That depends on the choices you make," I said. "Not on what I decide. Not on what anyone decides for you." I refilled his coffee, without asking whether he wanted more. "But I'll tell you this, the door on this street has always been unlocked. It always will be." He nodded slowly, looking at his hands. We sat there for a good long while after that. Two people at a kitchen table, not trying to fix anything, just sitting inside what was true. The morning light moved across the floor the way it always had. Some buildings, I have learned in 40 years of this work, do not need to be demolished. They need to have the rot cut out, carefully, and rebuilt from the inside. It is slower work. It is less dramatic. But when it holds for a long time. I am not a man who gives up on the things he has built. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And I want to know, when does patience end and courage begin? How do you know the difference?